Hey guys, it's Shawn. Welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I want to talk about the basics of forming a corporation. Now, this is something in practice I see a lot of mistakes in. Corporations have a number of steps involved in getting them formed and getting them formed properly. And what I see a lot of people do is they get through the first or second step, filing the certificate with the state, getting the name, and then they miss some of those additional steps as we go down the line. And we'll talk about that today, about what some of these additional steps are that you need to do. A lot will be dependent on your state law. We're going to be focusing on the Delaware General Corporation Law. The good news is you can probably take some notes for other states because a lot of states have taken inspiration from Delaware. So a lot of the core principles are the same, but you're going to have to look at your situation. You have to tailor it. As always, this is not legal advice. We're just educating you, giving you information so you can go work with the attorney of your choosing to get your company set up and get it set up right. Because a lot of people do miss steps here, and this can be a little bit confusing if you're not familiar, because you need to get familiar with these statutes, these rules, how to set the corporations up. There's some unusual terminology. Things kind of connect together in a certain way to build building blocks of getting a corporation set up. So it's not self-apparent unless you really, really read the statute and work through some cases. Even sometimes you have to look at case law to understand how the statutes work. But you really want to get these pieces put together right. So we're going to give you some good talking points today, some tips, some ideas, some things to work together. Kind of blanket disclaimer going to pop up here on the screen. This is not specific legal advice for you in your situation. Consult your attorney. So the statute will guide you on a lot of this. So you're going to want to pull that out, whatever state. Now, in the U.S., we generally have what we call the Internal Affairs Doctrine. And this has been worked out by the courts over the years. And basically, the internal affairs, how your corporation is run. And we're focused on corporations today. LLCs are similar but different, a little bit less complicated in general, but same type of pitfalls. And there's generally an LLC statute as well. So corporation statute, LLC statute, sometimes they're blended together, as in like the case of Texas Business Organization Code puts the two under the same chapter, although there's different subsections. But you're going to want to go to that statute. I'm forming a Delaware corporation. I'm going to go to the Delaware General Corporation Law. Forming a Texas corporation, we'll go to Texas Business Organizations Code. Forming whatever state LLC or corporation, I'm going to go to that statute in that state. I'm going to start getting information there. It's going to teach me a lot. The Secretary of State's office may teach you the basics, probably have links to the statute for that state. That's been my experience in many cases, that if you go to the Secretary of State's website, they then have links back to whatever the case may be, whatever the statute is in that state regarding how do you form a corporation. So that would be helpful. So you're going to let that statute guide you. And there are going to be differences in what you have to disclose in each state, what you put in your certificate of formation, certificate of incorporation, articles of incorporation. The name can even vary by state. What goes in there, how it's formatted, can all vary. So you want to keep that in mind as you're going through. But that statute will guide you. Delaware General Corporation Law has a section specifically on the contents of a certificate of formation. You'll see that these are different lengths. They have different amounts of information. Some people put a lot in there. Some put the statutory minimum. That really is a judgment call depending on what you want to do. But you want to at least meet, in general, that statutory minimum of what you are going to put in there. And so you can see here, the DGCL kind of gives you a checklist of what you need to do. What's the name of your corporation? Who's your registered office, registered agent? That's a person in the state you're forming in that will accept legal process if you get sued. Generally, if you're living in that state, working in that state, you can be that registered agent. But you need to have somebody to collect the lawsuit, and you're going to name them generally in your certificate of formation or certificate of incorporation. I've never seen a state that has a different rule than that. What's your office address, right? So some states will say, where are you conducting business, principal place of business. Some states will say, what's your address for where do you keep the books and records, right? That varies from state to state. Most corporations, you're going to have to name the initial slate of directors. Who is serving, who's getting appointed to the board at the beginning. So you certainly have that option in Delaware. You may have that option in other states. You name that initial board of directors. You don't have shareholders at this point to vote, right? So you're going to set up the directors early on, name them in the certificate. Number of shares. So typically you'll authorize a certain number of shares to be issued. You pick that number. Now that could be arbitrary or it could be planned depending on who you have coming as stockholders, what you're planning to do for future capital offerings. But corporations typically have a maximum number of shares authorized in their certificate, and it's actually put there in a state filing. Unlike LLCs typically don't have this provision, which means in a corporation case, if you keep issuing more shares, you got to go back and amend this certificate of incorporation to up the number of shares. So as you go through financing rounds, bring in perhaps new types of stock, issue more and more shares, you're going to be updating that. And then you need to say what the nature of the business is. In the case of Delaware, a lot of people just put any type of business permitted by law, give a very broad scope so they don't narrow it. But some corporations will choose to narrow their scope in their certificate of incorporation. That's all up to you. But these are basic contents. There's forms out there. Usually you can get them from the Secretary of State. This part here, most people get most of this right. You do want to think about some privacy and anonymity issues as far as the addresses of the directors going in there. Do you want to use the mailing address of the company? Registered agent, if you're living at home or you're working from home, do you want to disclose your home address? This used to be a bigger deal. Years ago, people used to really be careful about this. More and more now with internet searches and the ability of people to find information, a lot of people are, go ahead and filing with their home address, knowing that people are going to be able to find them anyway. But that's your risk profile to think about. And if you're moving into an asset protection type situation where you really want to get away from this corporation, maybe you're putting assets in there, you want to be protected in the potential judgments, right? There's only so much you can do in asset protection. But if you want to put that separation between you and the corporation, such that people can't trace and track the two of you together, you want to be careful about the addresses and names and separating them. Some states allow more anonymity than others, so you're going to want to figure out how you want to structure that to avoid potential issues. So all of that comes into this section. And that certificate of incorporation is generally a public document. Other people can go pull it, pay a fee to the state, and pull it, and they're going to get your address. They're going to get your initial directors. They're going to get all this information that you embed in that certificate of incorporation. They're going to be able to get access to it. And so then you file that certificate with the state, right? So that's what gets submitted. Usually there's a filing fee. Can be small, could be large, depending on the state. Could trigger annual taxes. In the case of Delaware, there's an annual tax computed based on your number of shares and other factors. You want to understand what you're getting yourself into. But you file that certificate with the state. And this is where some people make a mistake. They're done, right? They file the certificate with the state. They get a state stamped document back. Usually has some letterhead on it. It says, here's the name of your corporation you filed on, and usually states the date that they did the filing. People say, wow, I got a corporation. Okay, great. They don't work on some of these ancillary things that we're going to talk about here. I've even seen lawyers not follow this through. Maybe non-corporate lawyers who say, oh yeah, I'll help you set up a corporation. The follow-through is not there. So these are the things that you want to follow through because you want to build a complete corporation. You want to be able to track and trace who has the shares. You want to understand who's running the company, if in case there's ever a fight for control of the company. And then you also want to build that liability protection, right? Generally, one of the reasons you're forming a corporation or entity is you want to keep your basket of personal assets here, you want to keep your corporate assets here, and you want to make sure the two don't meet in the middle, right? You want them separated in case something bad happens on one end or the other. Somebody trips and falls, a car accident, other things. You don't want these two worlds merging if you can avoid it. And so what are some of these things that people mess up when they're setting these things up? Bylaws. Every state I'm aware of, requires bylaws of a corporation. So the certificate is public information. It's usually more cursory. It contains those types of things we talk about. Bylaws will generally be a private document unless you're a public company, unless you have some disclosure obligation. Your bylaws are not put out on a public website. People can't see your bylaws, but they are your internal operating document. How do shareholder meetings happen? How do board meetings happen? Can we have meetings by written consent, without having physical meetings? What happens with notices? These types of things get boiled into the bylaws. It's really how your company runs. Usually a lot longer in the certificate of incorporation, but it has a lot more detail. And you're going to go back to this from time to time. What do we do? What do we do with interested director transactions? How do we approve them? What votes are needed? What quorums? And a lot of times you'll have defaults built into that state statute of this is how many people are needed, this is how many people are needed to have a meeting, this is how many people need to vote at that meeting to carry an action, this is how frequently you have shareholder meetings. There's all these defaults. And if you're going to modify these defaults, typically that's going to go into your bylaws. So you want to make sure you go a step beyond the certificate of incorporation. You want to set up nice bylaws, and you want to get them adopted, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You also need to think about stock issuance. And this is where a lot of companies, again, miss it. Maybe they'll allocate a percentage. A lot of people do think about ownership percentages. Bob owns 80%, Mary owns 20%, or we're going to bring Steve in, he's going to be 5%. And, they'll do all these percentages, usually adding up to 100, which is good. But the way you carry that out is not to do percentages, but typically it is to issue stock. You have 5 shares of stock out of 100 shares of stock. That becomes the 5% ownership, right? You do it in terms of shares, and you're going to want to issue stock. You need to think about how that works initially, right? Are people writing checks into the company? Are you selling it for the same price per share, $50 a share for the initial shares? Or how are you doing the math to make it work? And what is the process of becoming a stockholder? Are you signing an agreement? Is the board accepting the offer? How does that work? So mechanically, you want a process behind the stock issuance to get that out there. Typically, a lot of the stuff will get baked into an incorporator's consent. So you go back to that certificate of incorporation, certificate of formation, articles of incorporation, depending on what state you're in. That document sets forth who the incorporator is. And generally the way it works is the incorporator gets some temporary power to help set up this company to carry out some of these things. So again, you got to look at your state statute, incorporator versus the initial directors, who has the power, who can do what. But you want to make sure you get this thing fully stood up. Bylaws, get stock, offer, figure out what the ownership percentages is, get the stock sold, get cash received back to the company. All these little things you need to tick off here while you're getting this thing set. And you need the right people to sign the right documents in accordance, again, with that state corporation statute. And then you'll typically have some initial meetings. This typically is just, in Delaware case, just to the board, right? You're not ready to have a shareholders meeting right when you start the company. You get kind of this initial runway to get the company started through the incorporator, through the initial board of directors. But you're going to meet, you're going to talk about the company, talk about the direction, document the meeting, start that good idea of keeping minutes and keeping books and records of what's happening. So again, and then you're authorizing things. That initial board meeting is probably going to authorize, officers. It's going to authorize the setting up of bank accounts. It's going to authorize any initial transactions. Now, some corporations, you get started and you're going out and testing the market. Things are moving slowly. Sometimes you're going to go out and buy a piece of real estate or do something quickly. So in the latter case, you're going to have meetings and have minutes and have things ready to go, where you may set up the corporation and then immediately authorize the purchase of a piece of real estate and then do real estate documents and transactions, right? Boom, boom, boom. Other companies, you may say, okay, we have our initial meeting, we are issuing our stock certificates, we're going to go out and have meetings with potential customers. The board is overseeing the company from a very high level. The officers should be carrying out what the board authorized. But you got to think about what needs to be authorized at a high level from the key decision makers, and then give the officers the authority to carry out more of the mundane day-to-day things. But you'll be doing that through some initial board meetings, one or more. This I've seen missed before too, is stock certificates. So you do all this great stuff to set up the company. One of the things you'll typically want to do in that incorporator consent or an early board meeting is authorize stock certificates. So, this is what our form of stock certificate looks like. This is who signs it. This is what our stock certificate says. Usually there's some magic language in there about transferability, restrictions on transfer, et cetera, et cetera. You set all that up, and then you authorize those stock certificates, but then also you want to get the authorized officers to actually issue that stock certificate to the person, right? So we talked earlier, maybe somebody's a 5% stockholder, somebody's 10% stockholder, 5 shares, 10 shares. You want to actually get that. Bob Jones owns 62 shares of XYZ Corporation, right? And then you actually give Bob Jones a physical stock certificate, which is evidence of ownership. And then you usually will keep a copy in your corporate binder of that stock certificate marked as a copy. The original stays with Mr. Jones. And then if Mr. Jones wants to transfer his shares in accordance with the company's documents, and he will get that stock certificate out, he'll do a transfer. And either if he transfers 100% of his shares, he'll surrender his stock certificate, complete it, and then somebody will then, get those shares issued in their name, new stock certificate. Or maybe he'll sell half of his shares or a portion of his shares. So he turns in a stock certificate. The company then issues 2 new stock certificates. One goes to the new stockholder that Mr. Jones transferred shares to, and then Mr. Jones gets a new stock certificate for the remainder, right? So you want to keep these stock certificates going. We see a lot of companies miss this step, right? They do a lot of the stuff, and then they just either forget or run out of gas or don't know that they need to actually physically give the stockholders stock certificates. And then generally you'll want to instruct your stockholders to hold that stock certificate as they would other valuables, right? Put in your safe deposit box, separated. Don't deface it, obviously. Keep it there for transfer, because if a stock certificate is lost, it becomes somewhat of a serious matter for the corporation, because they got to think about whether there could be additional claims against shares, right? So if Mr. Jones loses a stock certificate and then transfers the shares, comes to the company and attempts to transfer the shares to Mrs. A, and then later a stock certificate surfaces where Mr. Jones already had, prior to Mrs. A being involved, transferred the shares to Mr. B, the company has a real issue here, right? Which is why there's usually lost stock certificates and affidavits and other things that come in when you lose that stock certificate. Best thing you can do is have those stockholders safeguard those stock certificates. Don't lose them. That'll keep your life a lot simpler. All of this goes into the stock ledger, right? At some point, the secretary of the corporation generally will be keeping track of all of these stock issuances, right? Mr. Jones got this many shares. Mrs. A got this many shares. Mr. Jones surrendered a stock certificate, transferred these shares here, and got a new stock certificate. Usually these are chronologically placed in what they call a stock ledger. Again, this is something a lot of startup companies miss. They don't keep it. As you get bigger, this will generally be done electronically. Even for smaller companies these days, usually done electronically, not in a paper form, but small company might do it on an Excel sheet. If you have 4, 5, 6 shareholders, you could probably do an Excel sheet, especially if the shares aren't moving very often. But if you start getting bigger, public company, and you got people moving in and out your stock every day, you're going to want a database software versus individual, Excel ledger with individual entries for every transfer. But in some way, shape, or form, your corporation statute is going to generally require you to keep a ledger of who owns what. And most companies, again, miss this. A minute book. We mentioned earlier, board meetings. You're going to have board meetings. You're going to have shareholder meetings eventually. Delaware, contemplates a 1-year annual shareholders meeting. So you may have many board meetings in the course of a year, particularly if your company's active. But then you'll have that, typically, if you're following the statute, and a lot of people don't. But if you're following the statute closely, you're going to have a shareholders meeting every year. And all this stuff goes into what they call a minute book. That is where you collect the minutes, which essentially are the notes of your board meeting and your shareholder meeting. So you're collecting all of those together. And all of this gets collected under a broad category of books and records. And usually your corporation statute contemplates that the corporation keeps its books and records, may talk about having a location for it. And then usually there's access rights. Stockholders, the people that own the company, have the right to get access to these books and records to look at various things, bank accounts, look at who the other stockholders are, etc. Small company, usually less of an issue. Mid-sized companies, get into corporate disputes, becomes a bigger issue. Big companies, it becomes a management thing, right? Of what stockholders do you give what, when, how much information do you give out, how does it vary with other laws such as securities laws, etc., right? So this can become a very complicated portion of your business. But early on, you want a good record-keeping system. You want a secretary who's keeping corporate records in accordance with the things we've talked about in your corporation statute. You want a treasurer who's keeping records of all the financial transactions, who's doing what. So you can really show what you're doing. And all of this plays into this broad category of fiduciary duties. Generally, the owner or manager of the company has a duty to manage the company for the benefit of the shareholders, perhaps others depending on your corporate statute. But that duty is also carried out by keeping good records, keeping information, and showing what's there. You'll eventually want to open bank accounts. Most banks will want to see that stamped certificate of incorporation. Usually when you file that certificate of corporation, certificate of formation, articles of incorporation, depending on what name your state uses, you'll come back from the state stamped with a date and time and maybe a file number and some other information on it, usually in a corner. Comes back stamped. The bank will usually want to see that, and along with perhaps usually an EIN number, employer identification number, issued by the IRS after you get that certificate applied for by the company. So you want to get that set up. Bank account should, of course, be in the same name as the name of the corporation, and you should flow generally all your funds. All your corporate funds should be flowed into corporate accounts. Of course, at first, you're probably only going to have one bank account, so everything's going to get deposited there. As you grow, you may have stuff split up regionally. You may have different types of accounts for different purposes, but you want to get that set up early on. Folks, very broad overview here for you. Corporations are, again, much more complex than LLCs. They require a lot of moving pieces. Again, a lot of people miss a lot of the pieces we discussed today. You can use this video as a checklist, as a way to go back and check your work, make sure you covered all the major things you're supposed to cover. And then you can also go to your corporation statute, and I highly recommend you do that. And and also talk to a lawyer in your state where you're forming or where your corporation is going to be governed, and go through this step by step and make sure you're dotting the I's and crossing the T's, because that can be important later if there's a shareholder dispute, if there's a control dispute of the company, if there's a liability claim. You want this stuff in good order, and most people don't get to that step. So, or a lot of people don't get to that step. I don't have percentages for what percentage of companies don't get this done, but my experience is many, many small companies don't get through every step we talked about today in the proper order, properly signed in accordance with their statute. So that's a liability issue that's just sitting out there. And it may become an issue where you go raise money in the future. So get it done right, get it done early, lay that foundation. Similar issues for an LLC. I may come back and visit that. Would love to hear your comments, what questions you have. If you want a similar video on LLCs, I may come back and do that. Really want to hear what you want. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Drop some comments below. Let me know what your questions are, what other issues you're seeing around business and business law. We'll zoom in and out of some deeper and some lighter topics on this channel. So I hope you enjoy some of the other content. Look forward to talking to you again soon. It's your friend Shawn McBride. I'll catch you again soon.